Yeah, so yesterday, Ricky, who's going to present later, asked if I would be presenting with my University of Edinburgh hat on or my coalition hat. Coalition are an insurance company with about 100,000 policyholders. I think from my attire, I'm clearly not from the insurance industry. It's one of the few industries that still wears a tie. But what I'm going to try to do today is present both perspectives. So on the one hand, the kind of critical view of academia about how we evaluate evidence, and then on the other hand, the more practical view from insurance about how do we actually translate this into controls that work and use that to make business decisions about investing in security. And in particular, I think the core problem that What Works is trying to solve is improving the processes by which we invest in security. And the problem you run into as you do that is organizational change is difficult. If you're a security leader, you have to get the board to divert resources towards a security investment. If you're in the security leader's team, you need to convince them to invest in the tool that you believe will most effectively protect the organization. And then also, and I think this is underrated, the organization needs to convince employees that the security tools that slow down their work and the security processes that slow down their work are actually worth doing. And I wanted to start with maybe a kind of worrying case study of when I was asked to do this, which is until about 2022, the University of Edinburgh didn't have MFA on any of our systems, I believe. And the CISO of University of Edinburgh, Alistair Scobie, asked me to join the panel to A, decide whether to roll that out across the organization, and B, to decide how to do that. And what I very quickly realized is I would face huge opposition from especially academics in certain departments. I think, one aspect of academics, they tend to be quite smart, but I think more importantly, they tend to think they are right and take a lot of convincing that they're not. And then third, probably the most difficult, they have enough job security that they will argue with you endlessly about that. So I was worried that some of these staff would complain about, for instance, the privacy implications of an MFA authenticator app. And I think, that's unique to the university sector, but you guys will face, in your sector, the core problem that we're trying to address today. You need to convince your people to invest in security. And I'm sure you have your kind of dark arts to do this. What I'm going to present is a more kind of data-driven approach based on the idea we can bring evidence to these decisions. So I'm going to do that across 3 different case studies, 3 security decisions. And what I really want to convince you is that we can bring evidence to these kinds of decisions. So the rest of this talk will just be looking at different studies and how they have informed these decisions. This is one of my favorite slides in this presentation because it really gets to the core challenge we face when evaluating the efficacy of security investments. On the one hand side, you have vendor information from Google and Microsoft, and their studies essentially look at Gmail inboxes, Gmail accounts, and Azure accounts, and they compare the accounts that have MFA enabled to the ones that don't have MFA enabled. And using that research design, they show MFA reduces the rate of compromise by between 90 to 99%. So, this is really a silver bullet. If you believe Microsoft and Google, MFA is a silver bullet that really, is an incredible investment for reducing cyber risk. But then we have another data set from Marsh, who are the world's largest insurance broker. What they look at is the applications that organizations fill out when they buy insurance, and they correlate that with claims. And what they find is organizations who say yes to having MFA across the organization see a much more modest reduction in claims rate, so only of around 11%. And I think this discrepancy gets to the core challenge we face when evaluating what works. It's often not this high-level question of, do you invest or not? It's often more about how you configure the controls, how you maintain them. And in particular, when it comes to MFA, one problem with cyber insurance data is there's all different kinds of claims. So if you actually look into those, these are from Coalition in 2025, the different kinds of cyber insurance claims that happen, you see they're very different. So, we hear in the InfoSec press about sophisticated, advanced persistent threats and complex breaches. But actually for Coalition, the vast majority of breaches are just of an individual email inbox. So business email compromise, that's when attackers get credentials, they log into the email account. It's kind of like a mini data breach. Funds transfer fraud, that's a little bit different. It's when finance employees are tricked into sending money to the criminal, but often it's rooted in a business email compromise. Either someone compromised the finance employee's inbox and they conduct reconnaissance to build a better scam, or they just compromise the vendor's inbox, and then it's really difficult to detect because the change of bank details comes from the vendor's email account. And I think when you take this perspective, you can see how different controls reduce these different claims differently. So for instance, Marsh published a follow-on study that looked only at business email compromise. And when they look at business email compromise claims, they find that adopting application-based authenticator apps, authenticator app-based MFA, then there's a 65% reduction in email-based claims. So we see here a 5 times increase in the reduction in claims, and it's all because of these subtle differences in how the study is designed. But I think if you buy cyber insurance, by now, every insurer will be looking for you to have MFA on email. I think the second service where the kind of industry is looking for is on remote access. And the reason for that, we can see in a different kind of evidence. This is analysis that I did where I looked at all of Coalition's ransomware claims in 2024, and I looked through the forensic reports, and I tried to identify what was the initial access vector. And when you do that, you see the overwhelming majority comprise remote access services, so virtual private networks, also remote desktop protocol, and kind of the similar equivalents. And they're almost always, well, we have a huge bucket of unknown here. That's because often threat actors delete logs or the organization isn't logging correctly. But what we see is the most common way those remote services are compromised is stolen credentials. So again, this speaks to the efficacy of MFA because you can prevent a lot of those by adopting MFA on remote services. Then I think another kind of question we have is not just which service do we enforce MFA on, but also what kind of MFA do we adopt. So the Marsh study shows that actually, when you look beyond the very basic question of do you adopt MFA, and you look to the type of MFA that's adopted, phishing-resistant MFA is associated with a doubling in the claims reduction. And then if you look to those vendor studies, what you see, they're often comparing SMS-based MFA to authenticator apps, and they're finding that SMS-based is overcome and bypassed at between double and 4 times the rate. And this is kind of surprising, because if you think about authenticator app using a one-time pass, it's very similar technologically, where the service sends a secret to the device. On the one hand, it appears in the SMS inbox. On the other, it appears in the authenticator app. And yet, the SMS version is failing much more often. And one perspective here is that attackers are running stingrays, they're doing large-scale SIM swapping. I don't think that's the explanation. I think it's rooted in the ease of social engineering, where it's easier to trick an employee into revealing a code sent to the inbox. But again, kind of the core point I'm making here is these are decisions like probably everyone in this room agrees MFA is effective, FIDO2 is more powerful, but what we're able to do with this kind of evidence is really focus in. In particular, the reason I think this is kind of an important problem, from the cyber insurance perspective, almost everyone says, yes, we enforce MFA on remote access, and yet you can see in the forensics reports, it's often not working. So this kind of speaks to the problem of doubling down on maintenance and configuration. So then the second case study I'm going to talk through is a little bit of a marketing kind of buzzy topic over the last 10 or 15 years. But what I'm going to try to do is bring some data to the question. So I'll just pause here. One thing that cyber actuaries have to do is build models to predict cyber claims. And part of that is picking the variables that determine, is this organization more likely to submit a claim? So I just want people to pause and think about what you expect to show here. And to kind of there's some people in the vendor floor who won't be very happy with this, but there's certain perimeter security appliances. So these are hardware-based VPNs that sit on the edge of the network that are associated with between a 5 and 10 times increase in claims likelihood. The reason that's really surprising, these are supposed to be security tools. So it's not only that the data suggests they are not working, like what you would expect is a bad security tool just doesn't change the risk. It actually appears that these tools are making the risk, worse. I think I know there's some academics in the room, they will maybe ask the question here of correlation versus causality. And this is where I think a really important thing to do when evaluating what works is triangulate across multiple sources. So I've already showed you this slide, but to the big takeaway is the exact same devices that we see associated in correlational terms with increased risk are showing up in digital forensics investigations as the initial access vector. So this should increase our confidence that attackers are actually targeting these devices, in particular because this isn't just an insurance phenomenon. I have the Verizon data breach report, probably the most important data-driven InfoSec report in the industry, finds VPN exploitation is growing year on year. Sophos, who will present later, and also Arctic Wolf, they're like kind of MDR, digital forensics providers. They find the same things. VPNs are the most common kind of initial access vector for ransomware gangs. So this kind of triangulation, increase our confidence that these tools are actually increasing risk. And I think, there's some kind of interesting questions to ask about why that is. One, and I don't develop exploits, so I have to trust other people on this, but a lot of these vendors have built proprietary operating systems 10, 20 years ago without state-of-the-art, what's now state-of-the-art, kind of secure software development techniques, and I hear they're basically producing unforgivable vulnerabilities. So you can see here the list of CISA KEVs, known exploited vulnerabilities, by vendor. But I think that's somehow a symptom. It's not the underlying cause of why these devices are increasing risk. For me, the big problem here is we as kind of an InfoSec community are too seduced by the idea if you have a sensitive system, you can put it behind a VPN and eliminate or at least reduce the risk. Whereas I think the reality is more like kind of this image. So I think the interesting thing about this recommendation is it's more an anti-recommendation. It's not that I have here really compelling evidence of an alternative. I'm just saying legacy VPNs, especially SSL-based VPNs, are really, really risky, and your organization should move away. So in terms of how you would actually recommend an alternative, you have to use first principles. So for instance, my definition of zero trust is basically putting services behind a centralized single sign-on that is issuing authentication based on signals beyond just network location and password. So you also have multi-factor authentication. Ideally, you also have signals around the device, the time it's being accessed, building up a more contextual picture. And I think in particular, if that is a SaaS-based system, you avoid all the exploit risk. One of the most challenging things about perimeter security appliances is you're in this cat and mouse game where threat actors produce a vulnerability and then defenders are rushing to patch. If you move towards a cloud version, you're no longer in that race. And then I think, the kind of challenging thing here is we can't produce actuarial evidence that kind of broadly, and part of the problem is it's so nebulously defined that zero trust network access is associated with lower claims rates. But we can show that, for instance, the alternatives are much higher. To me, the more convincing piece of information is the digital forensics reports are not finding these kinds of solutions are being compromised. And then also, if you look to the known exploited vulnerabilities lists, they very rarely affect these kinds of technologies. Not completely true. There was a few vulnerabilities in Zscaler last summer. So then the final one I'm going to get onto is MDR. And in particular, what I kind of want you to take away from this talk is the different kinds of evidence we can bring to bear. So this is kind of an unusual one, but to me it's actually very convincing. I think when we see attackers discuss different technologies, the fact that they are paying attention to a specific security control is telling. So this is an extract from a ransomware leak where a ransomware gang discussed the efficacy of different EDRs, and we also know ransomware groups are investing in EDR blockers. So all of this is evidence that actually these techniques work. Sorry, these tools work, because otherwise, attackers wouldn't be talking about them. To me, I would love for you to take this to the board if one of your solutions was at the bottom here. I think the fact that ransomware gangs rate it at the bottom is kind of necessary. Another piece of evidence is over time, we're seeing this shift away from malware. In particular, there's been some evidence of ransomware groups encrypting off the device. And all of this speaks to kind of how MDR is actually materially changing attacker behavior. I think, again, we see this problem of configuration details mattering. So again, this is Marsh data. And what they show is if you just say you have endpoint detection and response, there's a 17% reduction. Whereas if you put it in blocking mode, or you fully deploy it across your network, you kind of double the risk reduction, assuming this is a causal relationship. And similar for MDR. I think another point to make is I've been mostly focusing on reducing the frequency of incidents. Another point is severity. So I don't think this is a great study. It's based on questionnaire data with kind of an unknown kind of sample. But it speaks to the idea that also when we evaluate things like managed detection and response, we need to look at the reduction in severity as well. And then I think one of the most encouraging aspects of the MDR space is the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations, where they actually go tool by tool, and they can show that, for instance, CrowdStrike detected about 95% of the TTPs, whereas some of these other providers are down at about 50%. So, this again speaks to not just the decision, do you buy MDR, but also the question of which MDR do you buy? And yeah, we can kind of map out these different information sources, and you can see how we're triangulating different sources. We're showing it reduces likelihood, we're showing it reduces severity, we're able to zoom in on the efficacy of different tools, and then finally, we can increase our causal confidence by looking at how it changes attacker behavior. So, if I could have kind of one takeaway from this talk, I'm sure, you guys have adopted MFA, it's not news to you guys. Maybe some of you are running perimeter security appliances, would love to see you move away from legacy providers. Maybe it helps a few people justify moving from an internal SOC to a managed provider. But I don't think that's really well, it's important, but the core point I want to make is we as a community can do evidence-based security decisions. And we're really just at the start. It was speaking to some of Helen's teams, like, for instance, Ricky and Tom, that really gave me the impetus to start pulling this information together. But I really think we as a community need to basically encourage vendors, encourage academics to actually produce this information. So with that, I will say thank you.